The night was darker than usual, and the biting wind seemed to pierce right through to the bones. The city streets, usually bustling, were now empty, as if everyone had vanished, fleeing from the cruel cold. But amid the silence, broken only by distant sirens, a fragile figure walked alone, battling against the wind. Jack, a boy of only 10 years old, with worn-out clothes and shoes 2 sizes too small, was the very image of loneliness. His eyes, large and alert, were the only trace of his innocence, though they carried a weight no child should ever know. As he wandered the streets, Jack couldn't remember what it was like to have a home. The memories of the last time he felt the warmth of a hug or the smell of fresh food had faded, dulled by time and pain. He no longer waited for anyone. There was no reason to. His nights were long, and his days empty, filled only with the need to survive. But that night, something different happened. As he walked down the dimly lit streets, Jack saw a strange glow in the distance. At first, he thought it was a reflection of light in a broken window, a glimmer of something he couldn't have. However, as he got closer, he realized that wasn't it. It was something much more intense, something terrifying. A house was on fire. The flames danced, rising into the sky like furious serpents. The black smoke filled the air. The smell of burning wood and fear was suffocating. Jack stopped, frozen. His heart raced, not out of fear of the fire, but because of something he couldn't name. It was as if an invisible force was pulling him toward the chaos, as if, for the first time in a long while, he had a purpose. "What am I doing?" he whispered to himself, taking a hesitant step toward the inferno. He didn't know why, but something was drawing him there. Maybe it was morbid curiosity, or maybe it was the emptiness he carried, waiting to be filled by something. Anything. As he got closer, he heard the muffled sound of a scream, almost imperceptible amid the crackling flames. It was the kind of sound that makes your whole body tremble with fear. Jack paused, looking at the destroyed house, fighting the urge to run. But he didn't run. "There's someone in there." Jack's consciousness pulsed with the urgency of that thought. He had nothing to lose, right? He had no one who would miss him, no one waiting for him. So why not? Maybe, just maybe, this was his chance to be someone. And so, with his heart racing and hands trembling, Jack moved closer to the house. The smoke was already burning his throat, and his eyes stung, but he kept going, guided by an instinct he didn't even know he had. When he reached the door, he saw a body lying on the ground near a broken window. An old man, unconscious, surrounded by burning debris. For a moment, Jack froze, the image of the motionless man etching itself into his mind. The smell of burning flesh and wood overwhelmed him, and Jack knew that if he stood still any longer, they'd both die there. With more courage than he'd ever imagined having, Jack entered the burning house. He didn't know why he was doing it, but something inside him screamed that it was the right thing. His small, fragile hands grabbed the man's shoulder, and with an almost impossible effort for his young and undernourished body, he began to drag the old man outside. The path to the street seemed endless. The smoke suffocated him, and the heat made him want to give up with every step, but he kept going, fighting the growing despair in his mind. He only knew that he couldn't let that man die. Not there. Not like that. Finally, with lungs burning and body trembling with exhaustion, Jack managed to drag the man outside, away from the flames. He collapsed to the ground beside him, gasping for the cold night air, which now felt like a painful relief. Beside him, the old man still wasn't moving. Jack turned to look at the house, now completely consumed by fire. The sound of fire truck sirens echoed in the distance, but he knew they had arrived too late to save the place. The house was lost. But what about the man? Jack wasn't sure. All he knew was that, for some reason he still didn't understand, he had to stay. Something tied him to that stranger. Something he would only understand later. Jack stayed beside the man, feeling his heart pounding in his chest. He had never felt that before. He had never been responsible for someone's life, and in that moment, he didn't know if he hated or loved the feeling. When the ambulance lights finally lit up the street, Jack looked at the old man's face and knew that, somehow, his life was about to change. And then everything went dark. The sound of the ambulance siren echoed through the streets, blending with the muffled sound of the fire still devouring the ruined house. The crowd gathered at a distance, watching the chaos with a mix of curiosity and fear, but no one approached. No one, except Jack. He, who until then had meant nothing to anyone, was standing beside the old man, as if they were old friends, bound by fate. The man was still motionless, his eyes closed, his face covered in soot. Jack watched, uneasy, unsure of what would come next. He had never called an ambulance before, had never been so close to someone who needed to be saved. It was strange, that feeling of responsibility. He didn't know the man's name, yet there was something in that aged face that felt familiar, something that deeply stirred him. Did I do the right thing? Jack wondered, watching the paramedics quickly descend from the ambulance, surrounding the old man's body. His survival instincts, so well trained on the streets, screamed for him to run, to hide, not to get involved. But he stayed, not knowing why, as if there were an invisible force holding him to that moment, as if something bigger was about to happen. One of the paramedics, a woman with sharp eyes, approached him. "Are you related to him?" she asked while placing the man on a stretcher. Jack shook his head, feeling the lump in his throat tighten. He could barely speak. Fear of what was coming next mingled with the adrenaline still rushing through his veins. "Did you call the ambulance?" she insisted, now with a look that mixed surprise and compassion. Jack just nodded. "You saved his life, kid." Those words hit Jack like a punch. Saved his life. Him. A homeless boy, without a family, without a future, a nobody. What had made him stop at that fire? It was as if, for a brief second, the emptiness inside him had been filled. But the feeling was soon replaced by something more familiar. Fear. What would happen now? The paramedics placed the old man in the ambulance and were preparing to leave when Jack, without knowing where the courage came from, asked, "Can I go with him?" The woman looked at him, as if pondering the request. "Are you family?" she repeated. Jack shook his head again. I found him. I didn't want him to be alone. It was enough." She didn't ask any more questions. She just gently pulled him into the ambulance. And there he was, a street kid, sitting next to a man he barely knew but for some reason felt he couldn't abandon. The ride to the hospital was silent, except for the constant beeping of the machines monitoring the old man's vitals. Jack watched the man, his chest tight with anxiety. Every time he breathed, a wave of relief washed over Jack, as if he was the one fighting for every breath. With every long pause between the beeps, the fear that the man might not wake up grew inside him. They arrived at the hospital, and the old man was quickly taken inside, disappearing behind doors Jack wasn't allowed to cross. He stood in the hallway, unsure of what to do. The hospital was big, cold, and impersonal, and he felt tiny in the face of it all. A boy who didn't belong anywhere. He thought about leaving. It would be easy. No one was paying attention to him. He was used to being invisible. But then, he looked at the closed doors where the old man had disappeared and, once again, felt stuck. He couldn't just walk away. Not after everything. Minutes passed slowly. Jack sat in one of the hard chairs in the hallway, watching people hurry by, each with their own destination. He had nowhere to go. No one was waiting for him. And somehow, he felt that until the man woke up, he was also stuck in that hospital. Hours later, when the sky outside was already beginning to lighten, a nurse came out from the door where the old man had been taken. She looked at Jack, who was nearly asleep in the chair, and motioned for him to come over. He woke up. Jack's heart leaped. He got up too quickly, stumbling over his own feet as the nurse led him down the narrow corridor. When he reached the room, he hesitated at the door. There, lying in the bed with tubes and machines around him, the man looked even more fragile, but his eyes were open, staring at Jack with a mix of gratitude and confusion. Jack entered slowly, not knowing what to say or how to act. He just stood there until the man, with a weak voice, broke the silence. "You saved me, didn't you?" he asked, his voice hoarse. Jack nodded, unable to find words. But then, the man smiled, a tired smile but full of emotion. "Thank you, kid. I thought it was the end." For a moment, the silence between them felt comfortable, as if that moment was all they needed to understand each other. Then, the old man asked something Jack didn't expect. "What's your name?" "Jack," he replied softly. "Jack," the man repeated, as if he were etching the name into his memory. "I'm Harry. Do you have somewhere to go, Jack?" That question hit Jack like a blow. He knew he didn't. He never had. But he didn't want to say that. Not to this man he barely knew, but who, somehow, seemed to care. "I can take care of myself," Jack murmured, looking away. Harry was silent for a moment before sighing. "I don't have anyone, Jack. No family. No one to go back to." He looked at the ceiling, seeming lost in thought, then turned his gaze back to the boy. Maybe you and I can help each other." Jack blinked, confused. "What?" "I'm saying that if you don't have anywhere to go, you can stay with me until things settle down. We'll figure it out." For a moment, time stood still for Jack. He didn't know what to say. No one had ever offered him a place before. No one had ever cared. "Why?" he asked, his voice almost a whisper. Harry smiled. "Because I think you saved me for a reason." And in that instant, a spark of hope lit in Jack's heart, though he still didn't know if he could trust it. The silence of the hospital was suffocating, interrupted only by the rhythmic beeping of the machines around Harry. Jack stood beside the bed, at a safe distance, as if getting closer would be too dangerous. He didn't know what to think, didn't know what to do with the words Harry had just said. Stay with him? The idea seemed both impossible and tempting. How could someone he had met by chance, in the middle of a fire, now be offering him a home? That word echoed in Jack's mind. Home, something he had never really had. His mind drifted to the few fragments of childhood memories, blurred images of a house that might have been his, but that he could barely recall. After that, life had become a series of temporary shelters, places that meant nothing more than cold beds and indifferent faces. And now, there was Harry, a stranger, saying that maybe there was a place for him. "Do you really want me to stay?" Jack finally broke the silence, his voice trembling slightly. Harry turned his face toward Jack, his aged eyes carrying an expression that mixed exhaustion and something deeper. Perhaps gratitude, perhaps hope. "Yes, kid, I do." He paused, his breathing still heavy and uneven. "I spent so much time alone with no one to share life with. I don't know if you feel the same, but loneliness, it eats away at you inside, like a fire that never goes out." Harry's words pierced Jack like sharp blades. Loneliness, that old acquaintance, the pain of not belonging anywhere. Jack knew that feeling better than anything else. And, for the first time, he realized that maybe he wasn't alone in this. He looked at Harry, trying to find the right words, but all he managed was a hesitant nod. "I don't know how it's going to be," Jack began, his voice barely a whisper, "but I'll try." Harry smiled, a tired but sincere smile. "Trying is all we need right now, kid. Just try." The silence fell between them again, but this time, it wasn't the same uncomfortable silence as before. It was almost peaceful, as if, somehow, they had both found a small island amid the ocean of their own uncertainties. Jack spent the rest of the night there, sitting in an uncomfortable chair in the corner of Harry's room, watching the old man fall asleep. The pale morning light began to filter into the room, and Jack realized that, for the first time in a long time, he wasn't in a hurry to leave anywhere. He didn't feel that urgent impulse to flee, to disappear before someone could send him away. Maybe it was the exhaustion, or maybe it was the strange connection beginning to form between him and Harry, but Jack stayed. And when morning finally came, he was still there. Days passed, and Jack returned to the hospital every day. He didn't exactly know why he did it. Maybe because, every time he thought about not showing up, a strange sensation, like a growing emptiness, pushed him back to that cold, impersonal corridor. With each visit, Harry seemed stronger, and the relationship between the two, though mostly silent, began to solidify. Then came the day when Harry was finally discharged. The doctor explained that the recovery would be long and that Harry would need care while his house, destroyed by the fire, was rebuilt. The mention of the house sent a chill through Jack. He remembered the fire, the flames devouring everything, the fear, and the strange feeling of being destined to be there at that exact moment. On the way to the temporary shelter where Harry would stay until the house was rebuilt, Jack walked beside the old man, feeling a mix of emotions. He still hadn't said whether he would stay for real. He didn't know if he could believe this was real, that someone like Harry could want someone like him. When they arrived, Harry turned to Jack, as if reading his thoughts. "I'm not going to force you to do anything, Jack. If you want to leave, I understand." Jack was silent for a long moment, looking at the ground, his hands in his pockets. He wanted to run, wanted to go back to the streets he knew so well. It was easier to live without getting attached, without expecting anything. But at the same time, there was something about Harry, something about what he said about loneliness, that echoed deep within Jack. He knew what that felt like, and suddenly, the idea of leaving someone behind, of abandoning him to loneliness, seemed unbearable. "I'll stay," Jack said, almost not believing the words that came out of his mouth. "But just until you get better?" Harry nodded, respecting Jack's space. "That's okay, kid. One day at a time." The days that followed were full of small routines, something Jack wasn't used to. He helped Harry with simple tasks, like carrying groceries or picking up medicine from the pharmacy. The coexistence was quiet, without big conversations or declarations. But there was a kind of silent understanding between them, as if they both knew they were dealing with their own internal battles. One night, while they were eating dinner in silence, Harry looked at Jack, as if pondering something for a long time. "You've never talked about your family, Jack?" The question hung in the air, heavy but not intrusive. Jack stopped chewing, his eyes fixed on the plate in front of him. A tremor passed through his hands, and he felt his throat tighten. He hated talking about it, hated remembering. "I don't have anyone," he said, dryly, trying to end the conversation. But Harry didn't give up. "I used to think I didn't have anyone either. But sometimes life surprises us." Jack sighed, irritated by the persistence, but something in Harry's tone disarmed him. "They left me," he murmured, not raising his eyes. "They didn't come back." The silence that followed was crushing. Harry didn't push any further. Instead, he placed his hand on the table, extending it slightly toward Jack, without forcing, without demanding, just offering a gesture of comfort. Jack looked at the hand for a long moment, his thoughts a chaotic storm, and, slowly, hesitantly, he reached out and held Harry's hand, just for an instant. It was brief, but in that simple gesture, something broke inside Jack. It wasn't a cure. It wasn't the end of his fears, but it was the beginning of something new. And that was more than he had ever expected to have. Jack looked at the ruined house, its remains still blackened from the fire. Harry, beside him, took a deep breath, as if absorbing the scene, the pain, and the possibility of starting over. The sight was devastating, but there was something in Harry that Jack didn't understand. He didn't seem defeated. There was, in the old man's tired eyes, a spark of determination. Something that said, even in the face of such destruction, he believed it was possible to rebuild. "We're going to do this together," Harry said softly, without taking his eyes off the house. "It'll take time, but if you stay, it'll be our project." Jack, with his arms crossed, felt the weight of those words. It was strange to hear of ours, as if he were part of something. But, as he looked at the wreckage, he realized there was more there than just burned wood and bricks. There was an opportunity, a chance to create something different, something he had never had. "What do you think?" Harry asked, his voice full of expectation. Jack shrugged, hiding the turmoil inside him. "I guess I can try," he replied, his voice low. "And so, In the days that followed, Jack began helping with small tasks. Initially, it was hard to get involved. He still felt like a stranger, a temporary visitor in Harry's life. But as they cleaned up the rubble and discussed plans for the rebuild, something started to change. With each hammer blow, with each new board laid, Jack began to feel that maybe this wasn't just a job. Maybe it was the beginning of something new. Harry, always patient, didn't push him. He let Jack find his own pace, his own space. And in small moments, like when they sat to rest under the sun or shared an impromptu meal amid the construction, Jack started to realize that the loneliness that had once consumed him was slowly losing its grip. "I think, after all, I'm not that bad at this," Jack said one day, trying to hide the slight smile that threatened to appear. Harry laughed, a soft and genuine laugh. "I always knew you had talent, kid." And in that moment, something broke inside Jack. It wasn't big. It wasn't a complete change. But for the first time, he started to believe that maybe, just maybe, there could be a place for him here. The late afternoon brought an orange sky, and the silence between Jack and Harry as they worked on the house was comfortable. They were resting on the partially rebuilt porch, both sweaty and covered in dust. It was then that Harry, staring at the horizon, broke the silence. "Jack, you never talked about how you ended up on the streets." Jack froze. It wasn't something he liked to remember, much less talk about. But there, beside Harry, the question didn't seem like an invasion. It was more like an invitation. Still, he hesitated. The memories were difficult, like a weight he had been carrying for years. "I don't like talking about it," Jack murmured, fiddling with the gravel beside him. Harry nodded, respecting the space. But after a long silence, Jack felt a need to speak. Maybe because, in that place he was now starting to call home, he finally didn't have to carry everything alone. "My mom left me when I was 6. She said she'd be back soon. But she never came back," Jack said, his voice faltering slightly. "I went from shelter to shelter. Every time I started to get attached to a place, they'd send me to another. So I got tired of trying. One day, I just left." Harry didn't say anything right away, but Jack felt that the old man was truly listening. That silence Harry maintained, without judgment, without hurry, made Jack continue. "It's easier not to get attached to anyone. I learned that fast. If you don't expect anything, you can't be disappointed." The words came out with a bitterness Jack didn't even know he still carried. He expected to feel lighter after saying it, but instead, he felt exposed, vulnerable. What would Harry think of him now? Harry sighed deeply, as if reflecting on what Jack had said. "I understand. I've lost a lot of people too. And over time, I started to believe it was better to be alone. But, sometimes life surprises us." Jack looked at him, seeking some answer in his time-worn face. Was Harry right? Could it be that, after so much time, he could believe he wasn't condemned to be alone? It was hard to accept that possibility. Hard to believe that, for the first time, someone wouldn't abandon him. "Do you think this will last?" Jack asked softly, almost afraid of the answer. Harry smiled, a smile full of tenderness. "I don't know, Jack, but I do know that, for now, we're not alone." Jack swallowed hard. Maybe he wasn't ready to fully believe that yet, but at that moment, sitting next to Harry, the weight of the past seemed a little less crushing. The days passed, and Jack and Harry's life settled into a quiet routine. The house, little by little, took on a new form, and Jack felt, for the first time, like he was part of something. But a shadow began to grow in the back of Harry's mind, something he couldn't ignore. Jack wasn't just a boy without a family. He was a boy without documents, without legal protection, and that worried him deeply. One night, as they were sitting at the table, Harry finally decided to bring it up. The dim kitchen light cast soft shadows on Jack's face, who was eating in silence. Harry took a deep breath before starting. "Jack, have you thought about your future?" he asked, trying to keep his tone calm. Jack frowned, lifting his eyes. Future? He seemed puzzled. The future for Jack had always been something abstract, distant. He lived in the present, one day at a time, without thinking much about what would come next. "I don't know. I've never thought about it. Harry nodded, understanding. I was thinking, what if you wanted to stay here for real? I mean, officially. Jack slowly put down his fork, his heart racing. What do you mean? Stay? Are you talking about adopting me? The word seemed heavy, almost impossible to say out loud. Jack had never considered that possibility. Being adopted? Having a family? That wasn't for him. Harry paused before responding. I can't leave you on the streets, Jack. You deserve a home, a stable life. And if you want, I'm willing to fight to make that happen. But it's going to be tough. Jack was silent, absorbing those words. He had always believed there was no place for him in any home, in any family. But now, Harry was there, saying he wanted to fight for him. Something inside Jack desperately wanted to believe. But the fear of being rejected once again paralyzed him. What if it doesn't work out? Jack whispered, his eyes fixed on the table. Harry looked at him seriously. I can't promise it'll be easy. The system can be complicated. But I'll try, Jack. I'll do everything I can to give you a better life. Jack swallowed hard, his chest tight with emotion. He wanted to believe, but a part of him still resisted. The fear of being abandoned, of having hopes and seeing them destroyed, was too strong. You don't have to decide now, Harry said, noticing the hesitation in the boy. But I want you to know that, no matter what happens, I'm on your side. The silence that followed was thick, filled with emotions Jack couldn't explain. For the first time in years, he felt that someone truly cared about his future. And despite the fear, a small flame of hope began to light up in his heart. Harry smiled, a sad yet determined smile. Life has already taken a lot from me, Jack. But now, it's given me you. And I'll fight for that until the end. Jack looked away, feeling his eyes burn, unsure of how to respond. Harry's words touched something deep inside him. Maybe, for the first time, he was starting to believe that he wasn't alone. The days that followed were filled with a silent tension. Harry had decided to start the custody process, and that brought a storm of emotions to Jack. He could barely understand what he was feeling. Part of him desperately wanted to believe everything would work out, but another part, a part hardened by years of abandonment, told him it was crazy to have hope. In the courtroom, the atmosphere was oppressive. Jack, sitting next to Harry, looked around, feeling his stomach churn. He wasn't used to places like this. Formal, cold, where everything seemed decided by rules he didn't understand. The high walls, the lawyers in their impeccable suits, the imposing judge. All of it made him feel small, insignificant. Harry lightly squeezed Jack's shoulder, a silent gesture of comfort, as if to say, we're in this together. The hearing began, and the lawyers presented their arguments. Harry's lawyer was experienced, but the challenge was clear. They had no blood ties, and the system was always inclined to question the legitimacy of such a relationship. As they talked about Jack's past, about his life on the streets and in shelters, he felt the shame burning inside him, as if his story were an open wound that everyone was examining. There was a particularly difficult moment when the opposing lawyer questioned Harry. Mr. Harry, are you aware that you have no legal connection to this boy? That he might have other options, perhaps better structured families? Harry, sitting rigidly, remained calm. Yes, I know, but no one cared about him until now. No one wanted to get to know him or offered him what he deserves. And I want to be that person. His voice trembled, but not with fear, with emotion. I see him, Your Honor. I see the boy he is, not just what the system sees. And he deserves so much more than just being another number on a list. Jack swallowed hard, feeling a lump form in his throat. He had never heard someone talk about him like that. He had never been defended, much less with such passion. The judge was silent for a moment, his serious and evaluating eyes resting on Harry. And you, Jack? He finally asked, his voice grave. Do you want this? Do you want to stay with Mr. Harry? Jack looked at the judge, then at Harry. The fear was still there, but there was something stronger now. The certainty that for the first time, he had a choice. For the first time, someone wanted him for who he was, not out of duty or obligation. With a hoarse and trembling voice, he replied, I do. I want to stay with him." The courtroom fell silent. For a moment, the world seemed to stop. Jack felt as if he had finally found his voice, even though it had been stifled by so many years of uncertainty. The judge looked at Jack for a few more seconds, then turned back to Harry. "We will carefully review all aspects of this case. But know, Mr. Harry, that your words have been heard." The hearing ended, but Jack knew the decision would still take time. There was an enormous weight in the future that they couldn't control. As they walked out of the courtroom, Jack looked at Harry, trying to process everything that had happened. "Do you really think we have a chance?" Jack asked, his voice low. Harry smiled, but his gaze was tired. "I don't know, kid, but whatever the decision, we fought, and that's already a victory." Jack nodded, feeling the warmth of that statement. It was true. For the first time, he had fought for something. For the first time, he wasn't alone. The day of the court's decision arrived like a silent storm. Jack and Harry walked together through the courthouse hallways, their steps echoing like the sound of a hammer striking, relentless. Jack felt his heart in his throat. He knew what was about to happen could change everything, but he couldn't shake the fear. Would this be another rejection? Another place where he didn't belong? Harry, beside him, seemed calm, but Jack knew the old man was nervous too. With every glance they exchanged, there was a mix of fear and hope, a palpable uncertainty that followed them like a shadow. When they entered the hearing room, the atmosphere was heavy, almost suffocating. The judge sat in front, impassive, with a stack of papers in front of him. Jack avoided looking directly at him. He sat next to Harry, his hands clenched in his lap, his body tense. The silence in the room was oppressive until the judge finally spoke. "This case has not been easy," the judge began, his voice firm. "There are many factors to consider when it comes to the well-being of a child." Each word seemed to drag out, as if time were slowing down. Jack could barely breathe, waiting, not knowing what to expect. He wanted it all to be over soon, one way or another. He wanted answers, but was afraid to hear them. "Jack," the judge said, looking directly at the boy, "I heard what you said. I heard what you want." Jack felt his whole body tremble with the weight of that statement. "Mr. Harry," the judge continued, turning to the old man, "I cannot ignore the special bond that you two have developed. This court sees you as a crucial support figure in Jack's life." There was a long, interminable pause. Jack clenched his fists, trying to contain the panic building inside him. All he wanted was an answer. Yes or no. Stay or go. And then, the judge looked at both of them with a firm but understanding gaze. "This court has decided to grant custody of Jack to Mr. Harry." Jack blinked, unable to believe what he had just heard. For a second, the world around him went completely silent. He looked at Harry, who, for the first time that day, let out a deep sigh of relief, and his eyes sparkled with tears he quickly tried to hide. "We did it, kid," Harry whispered, his voice rough with emotion. Jack still couldn't process it. Was this really happening? After years of wandering from place to place, with no one to call his own, he finally had a home. A real home. The tears he had been trying so hard to hold back began to well up, uninvited. He tried to swallow the sobs, but couldn't. Not this time. He turned to Harry, who now looked at him with a mixture of pride and love that Jack had never seen before. Without thinking twice, Jack hugged him. It was an awkward, confused hug, but full of an emotion he could barely name. "Thank you," Jack murmured against Harry's shoulder, his voice broken by emotion. "For not giving up on me." Harry stroked Jack's hair, his hand trembling but firm. "I never give up, Jack. Never." They left the courthouse together, side by side, and for the first time, Jack felt that he was finally not alone. The weight of the past, the pains, the cold nights on the streets, it was all still there, but now it was different. Now, there was a light at the end of the tunnel, a hope he never thought he'd have. As they walked back home, Jack looked at Harry and saw more than a savior. He saw a father, maybe not by blood, but by heart. And that, for Jack, was enough. The days after the court's decision passed like a dream. Jack still found himself doubting, sometimes waking up in the middle of the night with the irrational fear that it had all been a mistake. But whenever that happened, he would hear Harry's light footsteps around the house, the soft sound of tools in the makeshift workshop, and reality would comfort him. He was no longer alone. The house, which had once seemed like a pile of wreckage, was now taking shape. Jack and Harry worked side by side, painting walls, fixing windows, and rebuilding more than just a house. They were rebuilding their own lives. One morning, particularly peaceful, with the sun streaming through the newly installed windows, everything felt right. Jack was in the kitchen, making breakfast, something he was still learning to do, when Harry came in, with that soft smile he always gave when he looked at Jack, as if he were proud just to see him there, living. "This house has never been so beautiful," Harry said, looking around, his hands on his back, as if admiring a work of art. "You know, kid, I never thought I'd get a second chance like this. You brought that to me." Jack lowered his eyes, embarrassed. He never knew how to handle compliments. "You helped me too. I just did what I could." Harry laughed, a warm laugh, the kind that made Jack's chest fill with something he couldn't explain. "We helped each other, Jack. That's the beauty of it all. This house isn't just a place. It's what we made together." And in that moment, Jack realized that the rebuilt house was more than just a project. Every wall they raised, every repair they made, was a piece of the past that was being left behind. And in its place, a new beginning was emerging, built with effort, dedication, and above all, love. While Harry went upstairs to the second floor, Jack stayed in the kitchen for a moment, looking around. The house, with its now clean walls and the fresh smell of paint, seemed to breathe a new life. It was a symbol of everything he had lost, but also of everything he had found. That afternoon, Jack went for a walk around the neighborhood. The streets he walked no longer seemed as threatening as before. He still carried the weight of the memories, the cold nights, the indifferent faces, but there was something different in him now. A weight lifted from his shoulders. As he passed by a square where he used to sleep, he stopped for a moment, watching the children play, their laughter filling the air. He remembered when he had been there, invisible, no one noticing his presence. But now, he had someone waiting for him at home. He had a place to return to. When Jack got back to the house, Harry was sitting on the porch, sipping his tea. "You took your time," he said, smiling. "I went for a walk," Jack replied, sitting next to him. They sat there in silence for a while, watching the sun slowly set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. And in that moment, Jack knew that, for the first time in his life, he belonged somewhere. Harry looked at him and, in a low and calm voice, said something that Jack would carry with him forever. "I think we're finally home, aren't we, kid?" Jack smiled, a smile he barely recognized in himself, but now felt like part of who he was. "Yes," Jack replied softly. "We're home." The months passed with a tranquility Jack had never imagined possible. The life he and Harry were building, slowly, was beginning to solidify. The house was finally complete, each wall painted with care, each detail arranged with patience. But more important than the house was what they had become, a family. That morning, Jack was at school, something that still seemed surreal to him. After so long on the streets, the idea of sitting in a classroom, learning, and having a routine was something that was still settling in his mind. But little by little, he was starting to see that the future, which had once seemed like a distant fog, was now within his reach. Harry was waiting for him outside, as always. His smile was welcoming, a presence that Jack now associated with safety. As he got into the car, Jack looked at him, feeling the calm that only someone who has finally found their place can feel. "How was your day?" Harry asked casually as he drove home. Jack smiled slightly. "It was good. I'm starting to like history class." He still found it strange to say things like that, as if the simplicity of liking school was something new, but there was sincerity in his words. Harry glanced at him, satisfied. "History, huh? Who would have thought the street kid would end up interested in kings and revolutions?" Jack shrugged, laughing. "I guess I've already been through my own revolution, haven't I?" They laughed together, and laughter came easily now. When they arrived home, Jack got out of the car and looked at the house with a pride he had never felt before. The house, which had once been a symbol of destruction, was now a place of life, of rebirth. That night, while Harry read a book in the armchair and Jack finished his homework, something simple happened. But for Jack, it meant the world. He looked around and realized that, for the first time, he was at peace. There was no fear of the future, no anxiety about where he would sleep or with whom. For the first time, he knew that tomorrow would bring something good. "Harry," Jack called, his voice calm but full of emotion. Harry looked at him, closing the book on his lap. "What is it, kid?" Jack hesitated for a moment, the words stuck in his throat, before finally saying something he had been carrying inside for a long time. "Thank you for giving me a chance. For not giving up." Harry smiled, his eyes misty with pride. "You gave me a chance too, Jack. Never forget that." And there, in that silence full of meaning, they both knew they had found what they had always been looking for: a home, each other, and, most importantly, a future. As night fell, Jack sat next to Harry on the porch, both in silence, appreciating the serenity they had fought so hard to achieve. The past, with all its pain, was still there, but now it was just that, the past. The present and the future were bright and promising. This was the emotional journey of Jack and Harry, a story of overcoming, love, and a bond that transcends blood. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave a like, share it with your friends, and subscribe to the channel for more heartwarming stories like this. Check out our other videos and keep following us on this journey of emotional narratives. See you in the next video.